Hey everybody, welcome to Get Centered. And this month we're talking about Renaissance, rebirth, springtime, which is the transition from one state into another. I'm also going to be talking about symbols of Renaissance and rebirth. And there have been many, many symbols of transformation in history. And one of the most ancient symbols of the dynamic nature of transformation is the Ouroboros, which is Greek for tail eater, or the snake or dragon eating its own tail. One of the first symbols that we find is all the way back in ancient Egypt. And you'll see the Ouroboros, the snake, circling the pharaoh, and then the Ouroboros in medieval alchemy. So already we're jumping about 3,000 years, and essentially the symbol has remained the same. And then one of the fascinating things about being a Jungian, seeing how these symbols continuously reemerge and reappear in different ways, I'd like to propose that we also have more modern interpretations, whether conscious or unconscious, of the Ouroboros symbol. One being the famous M.C. Escher, the two hands drawing themselves. And then also one of my favorite films, Arrival, if you've seen it, and the language of the aliens takes the form that is very reminiscent of an Ouroboros for me. So transformation. The idea of transformation is actually quite simple. It's that something must die or change in order that something new can emerge. And generally that's why people come to analysis or psychotherapy, that there's something within themselves, in their situation, in their relationships that they want to change. Now, when we're talking about springtime and look at the cycles of nature, in nature, transformation happens organically, but psychologically and emotionally, we tend to hold on to what is familiar and what is known and safe. And even though we want transformation, we tend to block it in many conscious and unconscious ways. Here's a quote by Jungian analyst James Hollis from his book, Living an Examined Life. We have been defined by our history, our attachments, our provisional definitions of ourselves and others, and we cling to our history with a tenacity precisely because to think of ourselves in other ways is either intimidating or unimaginable. But the human psyche imagines more. So how does this imagining more take place? There must be a bridge to connect the two transformative states, the old with the new, the unconscious with the conscious. And Jung says that psychologically symbols form these bridges, and that if we work with these symbols consciously, they can help us transform from one state to another. So literally, when Hollis says the human psyche imagines more, the human psyche imagines in symbols. So here is a quote from Jung. The further development of the individual can be brought about only by means of symbols, which represent something far in advance of one's current state and whose intellectual meanings cannot yet be grasped entirely. So the concept of the symbol is that it connects the known with the unknown, the conscious with the unconscious, as well as past experience with future possibility. And when we look around culturally, religiously, politically, there are many ways that we use symbols all the time, and symbols as bridges, and some quite consciously. One of the most common, I would say, is the wedding ring. My wedding ring happens to have a dragon on it, which will come up a little bit later. But so as we consciously use that symbol, we are connecting a known past to an unknown future. There are other ways that symbols come to us that we do not use as consciously, in dreams, in spirituality, in nature. Sometimes we work with symbols in creative projects, art, or we're attracted to them in literature, culture, politics, films. But for part of this talk, I'd like to talk about one very specific way that a lot of people in our culture, both consciously and consciously, work with symbols that are important to them, and that is to get a tattoo that symbolizes something for them moving into a new phase of life. So for me, the dragon had been a very important symbol. I don't have time to really go into it, but from a meditation experience when I was about 20, I didn't speak to anyone about it for about 15 years. Then in my late 30s, I entered Jungian analysis, worked through a lot of things on my own. And then when I was about 45, and here we go, I decided, even though I was a good Baptist boy from Lubbock and wasn't the kind of guy to get a tattoo, I thought, well, I'm 45, I can get a tattoo. So I decided to get, this is a dragon in the form of an Ouroboros. You'll see the dragon connecting to itself. This is back in 2012. And what I didn't anticipate were the psychological effects of getting the tattoo. I felt myself standing up a little straighter. I could feel the tattoo on my chest. I felt like some of that energy that was unconscious that I'd been carrying with me for so many years was actually a part of my life now, that I'd actually taken steps to bring it into my life. And it had actually profound psychological effects on me. And I started to get curious about other people and their relationship to tattoos. So I began working with my good friend and wonderful Jungian analyst in Houston, Kate Burns. We began interviewing people, and I was doing photos, and we did several seminars at the Jung Center. And I would like to just show you some photos and some stories from 3 of the people that we talked to and how they incorporated tattoos, both consciously and unconsciously, into transitions in their lives. So this is a friend who's living in China, getting his master's degree in international studies. Here he is, and with the dragon tattoo that he got when he was in China. He was in a really difficult time in his life. And if you'll notice in the tattoo, there's kind of an unusual color pattern. So a very traditional Chinese dragon that he got in China, but the color pattern, he overlaid the Colorado flag, the color scheme of the Colorado flag onto his dragon, and had the tattoo artist do it in that form. Because coming from Colorado, the nature, so many things that were very, very important to him growing up, those connections, he wanted to somehow fuse with his current experience to carry with him. And then this is a direct quote from an interview that we did with him at the time that we did this project. Sort of describing this period of time. My name was on some government blacklist for a visa. I'd left my job. My thesis advisor had passed away. I had no direction and no idea of what to do, but I had this guy, and he pointed to his tattoo, his dragon tattoo, and I said to myself, think about what you've already accomplished. Think about all the people that are in this world that care about you. Take a deep breath. Think of the action and the right course, and take that first step toward making things better, and you'll get there. Nobody can take that away from you. So he had it on him as a powerful force, which really aligned with my experience very much. The next example, this is Elliot, and the first slide is of Elliot's finished tattoo. These are photos taken in 2016, a very dramatic and remarkable looking red-haired woman, surrounded by a lot of really beautiful, mysterious imagery, but also imagery of transformation, animals, both alive and dead. And now here are the pictures that we did. So the tattoo, when we first talked to Elliot, was unfinished in 2014. And here are side-by-side slides of Elliot in 2014 and 2016 with the finished tattoo. So Elliot, when he began the tattoo, was only vaguely aware of his gender journey and his identification as a trans man. And then eventually, in 2016, this is after his transformation and his gender identity. And it's so interesting to see and think about the possible unconscious yearnings and meanings of the tattoo in the process of that journey. And the final example I would like to give is of a wonderful friend and musician, Trisha Fox. And this first image, she said when she was quite young, she didn't really know the place that music would hold in her life. But when she was very young, she would draw with a Sharpie on her wrist. At that point, it was a heart bisected by a treble clef. And then when her father wasn't too happy about it, but she decided pretty young to go ahead and get the tattoo of the outline of a guitar and the treble clef as a reminder of what was inside her and that she couldn't really give up on that part of herself and those expressions. Another tattoo of hers in the next slide. She grew up, she has a Scottish family, but her father was in the oil business, grew up all over the world, spent a lot of time as a child in Dubai. And so the concept of home was very complicated for her. And for her Scottish family, she felt the phrase within the family was tea with milk. So tea with milk essentially meant home for her. And so she decided, because of her experiences in Dubai, and she thought the Arabic language was both incredibly beautiful as script and an incredibly beautiful language in general. So she got the tattoo on her foot, as you can see, in Arabic, meaning tea with milk, the kind of the concept of taking home with her wherever she went. And now she's married to a great guy, Dave Ransom, also a beautiful singer-songwriter, has a couple of wonderful kids. And right about now, so this Mother's Day in 2021, here's the next slide, she's releasing her album called The Gathering. And to bring together the ideas of these two tattoos, family and music, she experienced a lot of difficulty with postpartum depression, loneliness. She said the things that mothers don't tend to talk about. And she started this as a project of her own, working through a lot of the difficult things of motherhood, what that means for a young couple, having kids, and the things that she also has a degree in psychology, and said, it's so important to have these conversations. And for her, her and her husband to have these conversations through music seemed like the most natural way. So we'll have a link in the notes. So look out for her album, The Gathering. So just 3, and including mine, 4 stories of inner experience and how tattoos facilitated transformations. And I'd like to end with another Jungian quote. A symbol is the sensuously perceptible expression of an inner experience. It must be expressed one way or another, for therein is revealed its eminent vital force. It wants to step over into visible life, to take concrete shape. And so as I open this up for conversation with my colleagues, there's the idea, I wanted to make sure that this didn't just apply to people who get tattoos, because some people do find this very meaningful. But the idea is that everyone can be more conscious of symbols, whether this is through dreams, through whatever their religious affiliations are, but to be more conscious about the ways that we express these and the ways that we integrate these into our lives in concrete ways. That just to think about them as one thing. I'd say for someone in the Christian tradition for whom communion is very important, the idea of taking communion is one thing, but actually going through the process is extremely vital to that. So yeah, to open up the conversation and talk about ways for all of us to incorporate working with symbols in a more conscious way in our lives.
Thanks, Rodney. I always love when you do the tattoo presentation. I'm curious about something you said regarding, you've said it before, that I think tattoos are kind of unique because they're on our bodies. And the way that you've said it, I really enjoy, is that we think we're getting a tattoo, but what we realize is that it is interrogating us. Mm-hmm. Will you speak about that for a moment?
Yeah, just that, it's something that then once is a part of our body, it's something that we are confronted with either on a conscious or unconscious level every day. It is a decision to interact with that. And so for many people that we interviewed, the interrogation is about, people would say, well, I hate that tattoo, I wouldn't get it again. So the question is, well, but why and when did you get the tattoo? Does it represent a shift in your life in some other way? And most people said, yeah, but I wouldn't remove it because I wouldn't be who I am now if I wasn't who I was then, and that represents who I was then. So to have that sort of map that we're confronted with on my body, a reminder of my own journey. And for women, often we interviewed several women, victims of survivors of violent, sometimes sexual abuse. The idea of ownership of one's body was often very important as well. That to be able to say, I can take ownership of my body and express in the way that is extremely important for me. That also for trans people, not just Elliot, I talked to other trans men, trans women, for whom the idea of expression, one trans man who, the idea of dead naming is, to use the name that someone no longer goes by. But he decided to have a tattoo of his former name as a reminder. He said that is part of my journey, part of my identity. And though I don't want anyone else using it, it's a reminder for me.
I'm thinking about this through the lens of Jewish practice, and I know that there's at least a strong stigma against tattoos generally within the Jewish tradition, and I think there's a lot of reasons that people give about why, and there's also a lot of misnomers about what happens if you do get a tattoo. I think one of the ways that people have tried to dissuade a young Jewish kid from getting theirs, they say, well, you wouldn't be buried in the Jewish cemetery. Right? I'm sure you heard this.
I've had somebody tell me that once, yes.
Yeah, and it's like, wait a second, and then, because we're thinking people were just like, yeah, but what about all of those people who Hitler lined up, and not to get too, sour, but it's like he lined them up and put tattoos all over all of them, every one of them got one right here,
Mm-hmm.
And so just like you're telling me they didn't get buried in the Jewish cemetery, I'd stop, right? Please. So then the question is, what's the intent, right? What's the intent behind it? And I don't really, I'll be honest, now hearing you today, I'm thinking to myself, it sounds pretty powerful. I mean, as a possibility for people to heal. I mean, maybe there's some parameters around it, but it seems like such a opportunity. There's obviously another side to think about, but I'm curious what that brings up. Yeah, I don't know if you heard about that in your process of interviewing people. This is against my, morals.
Well, I mean, there's one person who participated whose mother was in the audience, and she said, well, can't you just paint something and put it on the wall? Why does it have to be a part of your body? And that was the ownership of the body thing. That this is an important step of my ownership process. But on the other side, that's why I want this to be the talk of symbolism and symbols and how we use them to be also broader than the idea of getting tattoos. And how do we work with these more consciously? If something comes up in a dream, or if there's something we really respond to, either positive or negatively, from a book or a film, or something really touches or moves us, to think about what that means for us, and how that represents an undeveloped part of our psyche that wants to be explored further.
Rodney, you talked about the symbolic mindset at the end of your presentation in terms of transition. What do you say to the person who might tell you, oh, I just don't think that way. I don't think symbolically. What do you say to that person?
That's a really good question, because of course that's a conscious thought. So there are symbols that person would respond to. They might have really strong feelings about after George Floyd's murder, all the conversations around the Confederate flag and Confederate imagery. That person, it's something that's relevant in culture. They might have very strong feelings about symbols and not think of it as a personal association. So I would try to find ways in the culture or religiously or whatever that they probably have a symbol would bring up for them very, very strong feelings, and interrogate, well, where is that coming from? What does that mean? It's just a symbol. It's just a it's just a drawing on paper. It's just this. Why is it bringing up this much emotion for you? And that as an exploration of, well, there is power in there somewhere. So where is that coming from? And why do you respond to it personally? How would you approach that situation?
I think that's right. I think it's, some of it's a semantic argument. It's like, oh, I don't think symbolically, but as you said, it's like, well, some things stir up some feelings in you.
Mhm.
And, you may not have labeled that as a symbol for you, but it is, whatever it is that is bringing up these feelings for you is pointing you to something beyond you.
Mhm.
That's, the difference between a sign and a symbol.
Right.
The symbol points beyond and the sign points to, something too.
Mhm.
And so I think you're right in the exploration of feelings that don't necessarily have a rational connection to something.
Mhm.
Well, and even things that don't have a charged emotion around them, like a stop sign is a symbol. These people who are saying that they don't relate to symbols constantly. They're just not minded that way, and or maybe they have a resistance or a reluctance to step into that mystery zone of life, which we keep discovering seems to be even greater than what we do know, right? So maybe they're just scared.
Mhm. Mhm. Well, again, like the Hollis quote, something intimidating or something unimaginable. So it's also an aspect of imagination. What else can we imagine to be possible for ourselves?
Mhm, mhm. Yeah. And I had a thought earlier I wanted to share just about somebody who doesn't yet have a tattoo, as somebody who doesn't yet have a tattoo, the transformation journey I've been through in terms of the acceptance of the other, whether we were taught ourselves not to have them, or furthermore, those that do have them are bad or scary or what have you, and obviously that's just not true. And so it's been such a magnificent journey of my own to expand my mind and my understanding that these symbols that can live on a human's body can be so deeply meaningful and transformative. So yeah, maybe one day I'll end up with one.
That's what I cued in on. I mean, you did say yet, so
Yeah.
I'm holding out hope that we'll go get a tattoo together. All right, Rodney, you want to close this out?
Sure. I would just say for everyone, the tattooed, the untattooed, the questioning, to be curious. Again, so often what I say to all my clients, we've got to replace judgment with curiosity. And wherever we find a judgment or a good or bad about something, especially something internal, about why we're responding to something, just get curious, get very curious about it, explore it, and see where it leads you.
Okay, folks, welcome back to segment 2 in our Get Centered episode on the Renaissance or Rebirth. If you'll check out Rodney Waters, his portion on symbols and tattoos, I'll make a couple references to his work and hang out after this about 10-minute lecture that I'll do for a panel discussion for everybody to chime in on thoughts. So I want to talk about a cycle because, when the idea of the Renaissance came up, I went to 2 scholars in particular, Cariani and Mircea Eliade, these 2 religious scholars that look at mythology. And in one book in particular called The Myth of the Eternal Return, it's one of Mircea Eliade's books, and he references it as one of his most important works, despite the fact that 10 years after he wrote it, he would change it. Still, he maintains it's one of his most important works, partially because what he's looking at is the essence of patterns that we human beings experience. And despite the fact that we would like to think that we can transcend nature and reality, we really can't. We're kind of bound in this, we're bound to this life. And yet in that binding, we also have a part of our consciousness that can envision itself outside of or transcendental to the existence of our existence. And in fact, consciousness is with knowing. The word, the etymology of the term consciousness is with knowing. So one of the core patterns that we're in is that we are born and that we live and that we die, and there's a rebirth. Now, we don't know what that rebirth is all about when we're talking about literal death. There are plenty of theologians and folks who want to theorize about that. I'm not one of those. That's not my area of expertise, so I'll leave it to them. But what I do want to talk about is the symbol, back to what Rodney was talking about, of birth, life, death, and rebirth. And what we see mythically is that any myth that we resonate with, that we talk about, that is created from creation, to like a creation story, to the meaningful stories that we find in our cultures, that there seems to be some pattern of, number one, those stories exist. They spontaneously exist, and no matter what culture you're in. So what Jung and others posit is that existence, what anthropologists tell us, the existence of those stories helps us look beneath the surface into the deeper core of our human reality that we can't really see beyond through our own eyes and with our own ears and with our own consciousness. We have to look at history. We have to look at mythology, because as human beings, we're beholden to these patterns. And we think that time is linear, and it's not. It doesn't work that way. So myth is something that might not be literally true, but it has a truth that's deeper than what's biological or literally true. And we can look to these stories and learn aspects of what's living through us. So birth, life, death, and rebirth are mythic enacts. We can find these mythic enactments throughout our various societal rituals. And I want to talk about one core ritual. No, actually, I'm going to talk about a few. But the first is that we have this ritual in psychotherapy about looking back. Right? We look back on our lives to see where we've come from. We look at our individual histories and to see what kind of forces are pushing upon us, what kind of adaptations that we've had throughout our lives. And this is an ancient practice of kind of reclaiming or respecting, to look again at what was before. Another ritual that we enact culturally is the marriage. This is an important dynamic of connection, and to be born together, to come together, to grow together, and to continue to get what Esther Perel talks about is that we are in our adult lives, many of us are going to be in as many as 3 to 4 marriages. Sometimes that's going to be in the same marriage with the same person. But the idea is that you create this container. Rodney mentioned the wedding ring earlier. In this container, we're born, we live, and we die and are reborn. And if the two people are together, they can be reborn together and they can fall in love. And then we get this essence of the container. And what Eliade would talk about is that the marriage is in fact a mythic, it's a myth that lives through us, and we are enacting the myth. And what happens, unfortunately for us today, is that we defer a lot to our technologies. We defer a lot, what I talk about, like the window and the air conditioning and the car and the cell phone. These technologies provide us an illusion that we're somehow outside of that reality. So a lot of our rituals become stale, and we don't have the same kind of attitude of reverence. And what Rodney was talking about earlier, that symbolic attitude, where we are mythically participating in an ancient process. It is not new. When I work with couples, one of the things that happens is they'll talk about the fights they get into, and I'll say something like, look, man, if I crack open the roof of any home in any period of time throughout all of human existence, you're going to hear very similar fights that exist. That is it. That is the way we work. So if we actually found a way not to be only within our perspective, but had a mythic worldview that helped us contextualize the processes that we live through, the process of death, that is not just literal. I mean, in our culture, we do a really bad job of connecting with death, because what we do is we like to hide it. We fantasize that we can avoid it. We take the elderly in our community and we separate them, and we disconnect from wisdom traditions. Right? We don't allow ourselves to incorporate the elderly folks, the wise, the wisdom folks of our traditions, to help us understand how we can live, because they're in the position of looking back. And ancients did this much better. So rather than being involved in the mythic frame of living, we've lost our connection with that. And this is a lot of what Genesis talks about. It's a story I reference a lot, because one of the aspects of Genesis is that we're to transcend our human existence. And Leela Scott, my lovely wife, drew my attention recently to a talk that she was listening to, wherein the fellow who was talking defined nature. And I couldn't believe what she was saying, because essentially the definition was something like, nature is defined as all things that are outside of the human being. And it really underscores that's exactly what Genesis talks about, is that we're needing to take flight from the garden, and then what we're doing is we're supposed to be dominant over all the natural phenomena, rather than shepherd, rather than be with, rather than harmonize, rather than figure out ways that we can be attuned and connected, mythically speaking, because the death of God, as Nietzsche would talk about, and what he was saying is that it was the death of this attitude that we have to the forces and powers that continue to live through us, each human being in every single period of time, and will continue to do so. These are the eternals, what William Blake talked about, the eternals. In mythology, in Greek mythology, the one primary differentiator between the gods and the mortals was that the gods were immortal. They were timeless, they lived forever. And so what we say is that here I am existing on this earth, and there are powers and forces that are greater than I, that there are powers and forces greater than the I that I think I am. And so rather than believe myself to be outside of nature or higher in some kind of higher order than nature, the mythic worldview is one wherein we can begin to actually connect and represent and relate with these patterns and forces that we're beholden to. And that, I think, is one of the reasons why we suffer so greatly in our modern traditions. I mean, despite the fact that we have technologies that help us make our coffee and tea and help us phone a friend and help us do all the things that they help us do, we still suffer from anxiety. We still suffer from depression. We still suffer from hurt. We still suffer, right? So despite any of these modern technologies, the Four Noble Truths of the Buddhists is actually true. There is suffering. And the way out of suffering is an attitude. I think one of the things they were getting at is to being in a mythic space. And death and rebirth is one of the primary mythic realities that I think we need to attend to. What Tibetans do so well is that this meditation of death is a daily occurrence. And one of the things that a lot of these folks will do is every day meditate on their decaying corpse, to actually envision what your body will look like when it's covered up in worms and it's rotting, like your face is gone. And that's scary to a lot of people today, because again, we've lost this mythic attitude that helps us relate and connect to the forces that be. And psychotherapy is one of those ways that we in our culture end up doing that. It's one ritual. Right. And marriage can be one ritual. It can be a promising experience of mythically relating to the forces that be, the forces, what ancients or in religious theory, they call the hieroskamos, the sacred marriage. It's the container where we come together and we enact these processes of conflict, of support, of love, of connection, of sacrifice, of forgiveness. And if we have that attitude, obviously the marriage can be a hell of a lot better than if you're envisioning this person to be there to meet your needs or to support you financially. So part of what the idea of death and rebirth is set up to do is to get us into right relationship with the forces and powers that be, these archetypes, these original patterns, these eternals that we're beholden to. Now I want to open it up to everybody. I hope I've stirred the pot sufficiently. So let me get us back into our, hey folks.
Hi.
What, any thoughts?
I'll start. When you were talking about connecting with that death image of our own decaying corpse, I couldn't help but think of the practice of yoga. And one of the poses you tend to hold the longest is corpse pose, Shavasana.
My favorite.
Yeah, right. And it feels so good after a really intense practice or a practice at all. That finish, that completion, but to practice dying, as you said, we completely ignore it at worst, and we, or maybe that's at best, and we pretend like it's not going to happen at all at worst. And so to actually engage it on a daily basis or even a weekly basis, imagine the shift we would have.
Right. You remind me of the the one thing I didn't say is I've got a class coming up at the Jung Center on a friend, Brian Marescu's book, The Immortality Key. And part of he's got a quote at the very beginning of the book that says, if you die before you die, you won't die when you die. And part of the myth of the eternal return is that in ancient Greece, there was this temple of Eleusis. For 2,000 years, they would go and essentially participate in a death ritual. It was the temple of Persephone and Demeter. And when Persephone goes down to the underworld, they enact this in some way. It's unknown because it was totally secret. Imagine that, for 2,000 years, they kept it sacred. And that process of participating actively in a dying, or the death of ego is what we would probably call it today, helps prepare people for this kind of attitude. And I think that, again, if we had more of that, we'd certainly be better off.
It seems like in the most basic terms, you're just talking about our connection to nature,
Yeah.
the human being's connection to nature, and that the idea of the civilization or the human being establishing an ego and coming out of the garden and out of this, that there's a kind of context in which it's necessary for our own, certainly mental well-being and physical well-being, but our very survival, for us to reimagine and to reconnect the way that we see ourselves embedded in and participating in, rather than dominating. I mean, we're in Houston. I mean, when we have hurricanes, there's no doubt who's in charge.
Like the plan, by the way.
It's and within a human being, the idea that the ego is really in charge is when forces come up from the unconscious and all these sorts of things, it is like a hurricane. The thought that the best we can do is humbly work in the context of nature, rather than think that we're somehow apart from it.
It makes me think of like the respect we learn to have of the ocean or of water in general, large bodies of water. You've got to respect it. And I loved being taught today that respect, of course, when you think about it, of course, it means look again,
Mm-hmm.
respect death, look again, it's coming.
Mm-hmm.
What a different awareness. And if I may, while I have your attention, I'm just going to read this Oxford Dictionary of
Cool, good, yes.
reference, because it is so
Thanks for that,
upsetting.
by the way. It was a
So
great
upsetting.
tidbit.
It's so upsetting. The phenomena of the physical world collectively, including plants, animals, and the landscape, and other features and products of the earth, as opposed to
Yes.
humans or human creations.
Yeah.
Therein lies the problem, people.
What was the word you were defining?
Nature.
Nature.
Nature. I want to key in on two words that you said, John. Consciousness. Sorry, also, Leela Scott, did I interrupt?
No,
Okay. Consciousness and respecting. Conscious respecting, I think. For me, I'm thinking about that process as somewhat of a key to this, is just a continual conscious, meaning with knowing, respecting, looking again at what's going on when it comes to the ways that the past bubbles into the future. The ways that our previous experience shifts our perspective about and assumptions about what may come, about what is happening, and how we tell ourselves the story, to me is the key for this almost like a recycling of the myth, right? Of learning how to continually keep it fresh so that it doesn't do what you so very eloquently described, is becoming stale, right? It's a good word for what's happening. What happens if you hold too firm to the myth without being consciously respecting the reality, which is that this is a quick burst on Earth that we get, all of us, right? And this birth notion and death notion are they're coupled, they're two sides of a coin. And so if you try to live your life in such a way that you're not understanding that there's the other side of the coin coming while you're in life, you're kind of you're missing the point, right? You're not being conscious, and you're not respecting. You're not able to do that because you're locked in. So it's interesting to me, this whole concept. To me, you pepper that whole thing with so much, gold and nuggets. So it's great.
Thanks. Yeah, I was actually trying to look up Jung's definition of religion, and I couldn't find it quickly, but it is something like a watchful, careful, prudent, attentive, discerning attitude to the forces and the powers that be. So, something that's not it, but it's something like that. And so the two root here are religare and religare. Religare, I think, if I get this right, is to read again, or religare maybe to reconnect, and religare is to read again. So you have these dual concepts of to rebind or reconnect something. Again, consciousness, to be with it. There's a dual like the yin and yang piece. By the way, that was my original tattoo. I was drawing yin and yangs all over my body when I was like 6. So the idea of to rebind, bring back together, to return, right? Again, that's another one. To turn again, to remember, to bring back together the parts that have been separated. All these ideas are religious. To look again and to be watchful, meaning there's a surface area reading and there's a deeper reading. And this is what Jung was talking about when he looked at the spirit of the times versus the spirit of the depths. We are these kind of meta viewers of a deeper reality. And when we're unaware of that, we suffer unconsciously. We're suffering either way, right? That's the point. Like, life is suffering, as the Buddhists tell us, and the Christians do too. And the thing, Rodney, that really, your comment about nature is that I always want to pay attention to who we hate. When somebody comes in and works with me, psychotherapy, like we talk about, who do you hate? Who do you have a negative reaction to? And you get to be conscious of how that shows up in your own life and how that may be of you. We can do that collectively too. And it is fascinating that I'm watching this show called Vikings, which is one of the best shows I've ever seen. The Christians hated the pagans, right? What was happening there? What was going on? And the pagan traditions were were based in nature. They were looking at the seasons. They were looking at aspects of religion. They were connected with the animals. There were more open and expansive views of sexuality. It was less kind of pure. And we saw a weird shift when the divine incarnated in human form. Not to go too theological here, but there are psychological aspects of that we can look at the myth and we can start to understand how that's living through us, not what was happening back then and there, but what is eternally happening right here and now that I am participating in. If I get too lost, I'm unconscious. And I'm like, yeah, I'm living a deterministic lifestyle that's been dictated to me by the powers of my early life and the forces of my current anxieties and all that, versus a more mythic understanding of I can be born and dead in my life many times. And then I can share that with my wife and she can do the same thing and I can witness her and we can participate in this sacred ritual, sacred marriage. And if we have this attitude, I don't think things are better. That's not the point. Things are deeper. Things are more powerful and more sacred. There's more potency and aliveness. And I think that's what we're seeking, right? That's something Joseph Campbell said, which was, we're not seeking meaning. We're seeking a true alive experience, the sense of being alive and vital and connected, right? That's what we want. And that's the mythic worldview, I think.
So we're going to talk. Hi, everybody. Hi. We're going to talk today about birth, and especially this idea of birth and rebirth in the springtime. I want to talk about this ritual from the Jewish tradition that really, I think, honors what I see as totally true in this situation, which is when somebody has given birth, after that ritual, there's a time when the woman goes to the Torah, comes to the synagogue, and says a special prayer to honor and acknowledge the dangerous passageway in which that she and that child passed through, in order for there to be new life. Which is, if you've had a kid, if you've thought about this, you know that that moment is so full, and not just of emotion and of expectation, but also of danger, real danger, and danger of death. Danger of death. It's interesting to me that the tradition honors that, but then I see that on the Jewish side of things. I'm a rabbi, and then I see on the Buddhist side of things, my Zen teacher Brian Arnell, who would teach on, in this, he would use the word for it to describe the process of birth as like a vortex, which is such an interesting, like turbulent almost experience. And you could imagine, if you're thinking about yourself as a child coming into the world, what it would feel like a vortex, just like that, in terms of that moment of being so warm and calm and nurtured, and to then go through this process of being squeezed and pushed and then you have to breathe, right? And it's like, it's cold, right? And all of a sudden it's a whole new thing. You got to eat for yourself. You got to, go for yourself. You got to do all these things that mama was doing for you until that moment, right? And I want to tell a story that I've never told before. This is apropos of just, part of the process of how this all starts to unfold, which is a story about birth and how it caused a real strong suffering in the world in a relationship that I had years ago. And I remember we were sitting and we talking and holding hands and just embracing each other and hearing each other and seeing each other and loving each other's essence in a way that I don't remember quite ever feeling until that point in my life, of being held just so completely, so aligned, so sweet with each other. And we were struggling with this issue, which was that we had come together a month earlier, and the first 10 days of that were spent in silence on a retreat, and we didn't know each other's names even. We had seen each other across the room in a meditation hall of, I don't know, 60 people, and spent 10 days, 7 or 10 days in silence, and then met each other and broken our silence and got to know each other. And it was like a fusing of souls that I think happened in that process. That's the best way I can honor what happened there. And she had in her mind, at the time I was wearing a different a style of kippah. I don't know if you can even see it, but I was wearing one of these. I was wearing one of these big ones because I was working on an ambulance in Jerusalem. And so I was wearing and in Jerusalem, it's really windy all the time. It's windy all the time. So I'm a bald guy. It's not just because it's a statement of, well, there's a good reason for why I do it all the way bald, but I was, I'm not trying to pretend that I have more hair than I do. And since this was a long time ago, what started happening was a practical thing. I couldn't find a clip. Sometimes people clip these onto to the hair, and no clipping was gonna do to this hair. Well, I was gonna keep that thing on my head, and I wanted both my hands, and I didn't to be able to use on an ambulance as a first responder. So I was wearing one of these, very practical. I looked for it I was like, how do I find one of those that won't fly off my head when it's windy while I'm trying to work? And so I was wearing one of these, and what I didn't know at the time, and she must have known, is that this is a symbol of a settler, a Jewish Israeli settler in some way, like, maybe just kind of a person who would go and live in the settlements in Israel. And so she had painted this whole story inside of her head, birthed the whole story a month earlier when she first saw me, that this is a guy who I could settle down with in Israel as a settler. And this is like, the culmination moment was this moment I was just describing. But what she came to find out was that I, in my head, had started to paint a picture, birthed the story a month earlier, that this was a partner for me who would come back to the States, who would come to rabbinic school with me, who would want to be staying in the States and serving in the United States. And when we got to this moment a month later, and we had already laid down so many roots of that relationship, you could see how that would come undone in a very painful way for both of us, because we both had different ways of birthing a story in which we didn't know each other at all. I'm telling you, we didn't even know each other's names in those first 7 days. We didn't know a thing about the other person, what their voice sounds like. We were in silence. And we had each created a story, assuming what the other person was based on some cues that we had found. And then ended up in a really painful breakup and tears and real heartache and sadness, because that was a really special moment and time and connection that couldn't exist further than that in time, because of we were just not going in the same direction at all. And that's what happens when we assume. The mind wants answers, it wants certainty. And so when we were sitting there in silence, we created certainty about what each other were and could be, not knowing, and not even knowing that we were making these stories up. And what happens when we do that, we get stuck in a vortex of birth in our mind. And that led to eventually the death of that relationship, because we held so strongly to the idea we had formed that it needed to die because it wasn't real. Right? We created it in our mind, we held it in our mind, we identified with it, we strengthened down, we even connected with each other, and then because it was artificial on both sides, without ever asking the question of what are the assumptions here, we ended up in a really painful death of the relationship and of those ideas. So that's what happens in death, and that's what happens in birth, is that we have this opportunity where we can learn how to deal with this and not get stuck in that trap. And that's what I'm teaching, it is because I don't want to go down those kinds of depths. And I've learned a lot from that relationship in terms of what I'm assuming. So I don't want to give you just the problem. I want to give you also a solution, hopefully. So here's the solution. So the solution is, number one, you just have to pay attention. There's no shortcut. You got to pay attention. You got to know that this pattern exists, that we want to know, and that we will do, a shortcut of trying to know what can't be known. We will try to solidify that. We will try to birth that into consciousness. Number two, back to curiosity. Start surfacing your assumptions and start asking the question of, how do I know that? How do I know that? Could I know that? Right? Had I asked myself the question on day one or 3 or whenever it was that I fell in love with this girl on that Vipassana romance, like, how do I know that? Do I know anything about this person? Do I even know her name? Right? Do I know what her voice sounds like, or her aspirations are, or anything substantial beyond what she looks like? So how do I know? Right? So had I been able to catch that, all those, the month prior, maybe we wouldn't have suffered so much. Same for her as well. And then I think the third piece that I want to give you is then you got to learn. And I think this has been my deeper journey, You have to learn the patterns and the process that leads to that so that you can know, because what I described is the surface. Birth and death and rebirth is the surface. That's what we can detect. But the reality that I've learned through my own practice and through learning through the steps of the mind is that actually of the 12 steps of the process, and there's 12 steps, right? Birth and death are only number 11 and 12. So in the steps of how we get to birth and death, there's 10 steps before you get to birth, which is 11, and death, which is 12. So I just want to emphasize that it looks like birth and death. And the truth is that underneath that surface is the rest of that glacier, right? The rest of that. So we know the past, we don't know the future, and we're trying to stay as much as possible with curiosity and excitement, and maybe even dealing with the fear of what's happening now. And this is the tool for that. So let's open up now. I'm curious what that brings up for y'all. And I have some questions to follow.
You know, where I am right now with that story is I'm thinking of sort of the inherent conflict, right? Of human nature, where it's like, you think of spring and the Renaissance and the birds and the bees and romance, and nobody really wants to think of that logically, right? Nobody wants to bring in anything that prevents them from making those assumptions. They just want to be swept away. And so that's tricky, like how to balance letting the mysterious, you know, forces at play that magnify, right? Like two people just feel the urge to come together, balancing that with, hang on, you know, what's the real story here? What's possible? So that comes up for me. And then along with just, if we were able to balance that, how much suffering, as you said, could be avoided. I can think of so many stories, you know, of friends who, if only everyone had just been upfront to begin with about what relationship looks like to them, they would have said, oh, you're not as cute to me anymore, because that doesn't work, right? So.
Right. And I'm curious, thank you so much for sharing that. In terms of relationships, I think it's a big deal. And I'm curious, in terms of the therapeutic context, like, how do you help others learn to recognize the difference, right, between what is really known and what is actually in reality, and what is just my past conditioning or desires for a future kind of a thing? Because I think that's where we get in trouble.
You got an answer, Rodney?
Sure. I mean, you know, in Jungian terms, we would call this projection. And it's a lifelong, very, well, it's a painful birth process of realizing what is me and what is the other. And, you know, sort of a little bit like what Leela Scott was saying, what was striking me so much is, like, we talk about rebirth and transformation in such idealized, romantic, and glowing terms. Think about the actual birth process. Think about what that is really, really, really like. And so we're asking for the results of that, but yet avoiding the process of it. And often the process of coming to terms with, that person isn't who I thought they were, or I'm not who I thought I was, is part of that really painful labor process. And I'm really intrigued by the idea of the 12 steps, that you know, we see this death rebirth thing, but everything that even leads to that possibility, you know, and from a therapeutic point of view, I can't help but think that so many of our addictions, no matter what they are, just come from a place of numbing and wanting to avoid the discomfort and difficulty of facing all those steps that actually do lead to the rebirth.
Ariel, as you were talking, I kept thinking about Shakespeare. I mean, Shakespeare took this on, forbidden love. Like, what happens when somebody steps in and says, you guys are wrong for each other? Like, it doesn't go, it tends not to go well. So you're
Nobody
actually
wants to be
talking,
that friend, right?
yeah, I like the question about therapy, because this is kind of a core conflict, that different traditions in therapy answer in different ways, which is like, if you can see the devastation coming, right? Like, do you intervene? And if your worldview is that suffering brings birth, and suffering brings wisdom, and suffering brings generativity, who am I to obstruct somebody's path? And so we don't know. I mean, I know for a fact, uh, difficult relationships in my life have brought about an enormous amount of consciousness. And I'm a wiser person because of it. And it was really difficult to go through. And so I think one of the things the therapy is caring. That's the term, means to care for, to make whole. And so you're little by little, systematically attempting to contextualize and help. Again, back to the talk that I just gave, there's this kind of representation of a mythic worldview that's saying, like, where do you fit in this process? And maybe ask yourself the question, what myth are you living out? Is this Romeo and Juliet? Is this, who is it that's constellating here? And I think that's one of the most powerful realities, is that there are only so many stories we can tell, right? And so which one are you living is a question to say, how can you reflect on that? Leila Scott, I see I don't want to keep going.
Yeah, I hope I can just get it focused, because I'm sort of having an aha moment at the same time. It's like, with each relationship, it feels like this opportunity to reenact meeting our own parents in a way. It's like, oh, I thought you were going to be a different way. And then you have to have the pain of realizing, oh, you're this way. And then, maybe you have to break up with your parents, or maybe you figure it out. But with each relationship, it presenting ways to individuate, ironically, right? Because it's really talking about coupling, but in a way it's really about moving more and more into your own truth. And there was a second piece that escapes me at the moment, but if it comes back.
Ariel, I also like the what you were talking about, the idea, the idea of what we think somebody is, like what Leila Scott's kind of riffing on, that we kind of create. And there's an old rabbi who says the God of the horses is a horse. And I've always loved this quote. It's like our early stages of relationship, what are called oftentimes infatuation, are beautiful and exciting and rich and like, I mean, oh my gosh, it's like transcendent and intense. And it's also this kind of savior complex that we're somewhat projecting onto another human being. And there is a death and rebirth in that, like what Robert Johnson talks about in We, the Psychology of Romantic Love. He says, he calls love stir the oatmeal kind of love. That's what we need. What we need is like stir the oatmeal kind of love. My wife the other day, this one right here that's just below me, the most beautiful moment was that Leila Scott walked by my office door, and the door was open, and she had this nice little sweet look on her face, and she just put her lips out there, and we just kissed for a second, and it wasn't anything big. And then we went back to our office, and I was like, that's what it's about. I love those moments of like meaningful, just mundane connection. They're not the height.
Right?
Yeah.
It's because of it's born of the alignment that you two have worked towards cultivating.
Totally.
And of the end of surfacing, right? At the end of surfacing what each of you bring as birth notions through your process, so that you can put them to death together, compassionately together, and move forward into the reality that each of you is forming and continually reforming. And there's no and each of you come with your own birth stories that there's an opportunity to move forward through.
Yeah, like what they say in relationship stuff is that when there's a fight, when a couple is in a fight, you're both in a complex. But when one person's in a complex and the other person's not, you're in compassion.
Mm.
You know, because if I'm aware of something going on with my partner and I know where it comes from and I can see it, then I'm able to approach her with compassion and she to me. But when we're both triggered, you know, what we call triggered or in a complex, that's one of those big fights that's enacted, you know, that kind of mythic enactment of like, wow, that's really powerful. Leo Scott, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say, like, similar to how we talked about in your segment about ignoring death and not practicing it. We do a similar thing with love and romance and relationship is we just want the result of the work and we want to pretend like that birthing process, that being squeezed through the birth canal, the pain of birth, like that doesn't need to be part of it, you know? So yeah, just bringing online just a reality check and awareness, not in an annoying, pragmatic way that's not magical, but just to tune in instead of tune out, that this is going to be effortful. The whole love is a verb thing, you know, for yourself and for your other.
So should we come in for a landing?
Yeah,
So
close us out, Ariel.
So the opportunity here is to bring to consciousness the unconscious assumptions and ideas that are causing your suffering, so that you can, that what has already been birthed that is keeping you in a vortex of pain and confusion can be resolved by moving out, surfacing it with curiosity and with compassion, and being able to then get a hold of what reality is. And if you want to not get stuck in that pattern again and again and again and again, then going to learn what is that's the tip of the iceberg, and then you know, how do we get down to the bottom layers where the other first 10 steps of 12, 11 being birth, 12 being death, how do we get to those 1 through 10 so that we can short circuit that process before it becomes real and unwanted suffering for everybody around, including ourselves.
Thanks, man.
Birth has been a part of a woman's life since the beginning of time, but we need to have a rebirth where it comes to how we understand women and their fertility. So I'm going to begin with 3 different mantras, and we're going to just feel the difference. I would like to make my body a welcoming home for new life, versus I'm doing everything perfectly to achieve pregnancy. And then, not pregnant again this month. I trust that my body knows best. I'm going to continue to nurture her, and perhaps she'll feel ready in the coming months, versus my body's betraying me. Something is wrong with me. And then I'm beginning a mysterious journey. And with every step, I practice letting go of my illusion of control. My body and my intentions are an invitation to life. And at that same time, I understand something far beyond my own or any physician's awareness is at play. Versus, it's entirely up to me and my doctor to get this body pregnant. We are in full control of this matter. So I began with contrasting these 3 different mantras because the 3 areas of focus I have for today are invitation, body trust, and acceptance of the mystery. Now, there may be some people sort of chomping at the bit wanting to know how acupuncture and Chinese medicine can medically contribute to fertility. So let me quickly run through this list. It can regulate hormones, normalize an irregular period, optimize egg and sperm quality and sperm count, improve ovulation, help to clear out minor scar tissue blockages, thicken the lining of your uterus for implantation, help the body retain pregnancy, help mitigate the symptoms of pregnancy, or help to deal with maybe an ailment where you'd normally use a medicine that you either can't while pregnant or you'd rather not. It helps improve lactation once baby has arrived, and it helps mama get her blood and energy back now that she's delivered and is literally giving everything of herself to this new life, and sleeplessly at that. So interestingly, though, as important and extensive as that list is, I've still found that that whole list is secondary to the reframes I started with. Women come in to see us for fertility who have already been told that they have to achieve pregnancy, or that their body is broken, or that the outcome is entirely up to their body or the clinic they're working with. And other than that being like sort of just a callous approach, the problem with that is that it puts the body in stress. And a woman's body in stress does not want to get pregnant. So contrasting that with, I'd like to invite life. I trust my body. I accept the mystery. That approach brings calm and joy and consciousness to the journey. So we've all heard of the phrase rest and digest as a reference to the parasympathetic nervous system, but really what it should be called is rest, digest, and be fertile. Because if your body is getting constant messages passed down from the nervous system that it's under threat, whether it's physical, emotional, or any other way, your body will protect you from conceiving. So it's not you getting betrayed or being betrayed by your body. Your body's actually protecting you. So that long list of benefits that I listed above is completely eclipsed by acupuncture and Chinese medicine's ability to calm the nervous system and to help it to return to and exist primarily in that parasympathetic rest, digest, and be fertile mode. So now that we've kind of reframed that approach to getting pregnant, how about a reframe for your body and how you relate to it? And this can be so difficult if you've experienced month after month with no positive pregnancy test, or you've experienced repeated miscarriages. It can be devastating, absolutely devastating. And that, coupled with our inborn human negative bias, we begin to think that we're broken or assume that we're incapable. But there's another truth. Your body is innately wise and wants nothing but to protect you and to bring forth new life. That's what it was built to do. So I even just want to pause for a second and marvel at how magical the female body is. It is born with innate and detailed wisdom around fertility. It has the gift of being connected to Mother Nature and her cycles. A woman has the ability to create, grow, feed, nurture, and give birth to life itself. But sadly, you know, it's been many thousands of years, and I feel that we're coming out of it, but there's been systematic disempowering of women, and we've been disconnected intentionally from our magic and the fact that we're creatresses. We've been taught things like that our period is gross and it should be hidden away instead of inspected and used as our fifth vital sign. Instead of being taught fertility awareness, we are given synthetic hormones to manage our fertility. And women need to know that there are $1 billion, plural, industries which benefit from making you forget that you were born fertile and magical. A woman must remember that her body was built for pregnancy. And many of the presenting issues showing up as infertility have more to do with the current conditions we live under. We live under too much stress. We're exposed to man-made chemicals. We have nutritional deficiencies. And so a woman's body thinks better of conceiving because the conditions aren't good. And yet we punish our bodies. We hate on our bodies for suffering these consequences. So on this journey, we have to remember that the body has not failed us and we haven't failed. Which brings me to this third piece of the mystery and the letting go. So the bulk of the fertility journey is a lot of sitting in darkness and mystery and feeling out of control. And this may sound totally miserable, but it's good because it's practice. The fact is that once the second half of every woman's cycle is deeply mysterious, whether you want to achieve pregnancy or you don't. You have to sit in wonder and darkness and a lack of control about whether your life is about to completely change or not. And that's an opportunity to practice this conscious letting go of control. And then if you do get that positive test, you've got this period of time when you're waiting to find out, is this embryo viable? Will it have a heartbeat? That feels like eons. Another opportunity to practice sitting in the darkness and the mystery and the letting go of control. And then there's that notorious 3-month mark we wait for, to see if that pregnancy is going to stick. And that feels like an eternity. And then we let our guards down a little bit. But the truth is, we don't really know even at that point, because there's the old adage, every apple seed is not going to become an apple tree. And so we've already begun as mothers to live with the fear, the deep, deep fear of losing our young. And then once they're outside of our bodies, the opportunity to practice implementing this consciousness is so important. The managing of the fear and anxiety about our little one getting hurt or losing them, because I'm here to tell you, it will consume you if you don't. And it's just not fair to our children to live in that space. We really must incorporate a practice of mindfulness around this process of the mystery and letting go, even all the while that we're holding on tight. So you may be thinking, like, this sounds like anything but joy. But the thing is, we have to say out loud what we feel. And any woman who is aware of her emotions knows that even if it lurks deep beneath the surface, this fear is immense and it feels like it can take you down. But what's exciting about speaking it and relating to it and practicing getting used to darkness, mystery, and letting go is that is going to make you a much more conscious parent. And I can't think of any kind of better parent than one who is in the process of awakening and becoming more and more conscious. So with this last minute, I just want to run through some practical tips here. Of course, get acupuncture. As I said before, super effective. We need to get enough sleep, get quality food, manage our stress, meditate if possible, and keep it fun versus technical. There are a couple of resources that I thought it would be worthwhile to mention, but we'll put them in the liner notes below.
All right. Not to go directly at the heart of it all, but the question that I was really contemplating is, what are the messages that you received about mothering and sexuality in your body and your period when you were growing up? Maybe that's better to be general too. I mean, what messages did you hear that were being taught to you and your peers?
Well, having had a few issues growing up around fertility organs, I was taught very early that I have no control, and I know that sounds ironic because we're talking about letting go of control, but that my body didn't have the innate wisdom that it needed. And that medical intervention was needed, and I needed to be cut on and given this chemical. And with what I know now, that was absolutely unnecessary. And I have lifelong, scar tissue consequences because I didn't know better, so I didn't, I grew up in a household of women. So it wasn't like I so much felt like in my own house, I needed to hide but I very much just am aware. It's like it just seeps through the walls, right? the whole internalized women's oppression thing. Like, it's just everywhere you look. So had somebody told me when I was getting my first period, or maybe even a little bit before that, that I have a magical body that was built with this innate wisdom and was capable of so much. And here's the ways you're going to be aware of your cycle and what it's telling you, because there are messages, you know, the whole time, not just when you're bleeding. We're getting these messages from our bodies, you know, and if we knew how to read those signs, I mean, it's so enabling and empowering.
Yeah. I immediately had this like memories, you know, when being in 6th grade, and of course there were some of the girls in class that would start bleeding, and, you know, like, I just don't know if we had enough, if the as a guy, like, we didn't have enough framework around that to help us understand it. And so it's an embarrassing process because we don't have the cultural scaffolding to say, this is what happens, this is what goes on, this is how, you know, because of the repressive, like, let's hide it. I think one woman I was talking to at one point was kind of initiating a younger girl who had just started her period, and she was like, look at all these girls on the high school campus. There are many of them that are having their periods right now. You know, so it's fine. It's not something that you can still react or interact in the world, but I just think I'm very sensitive to that anxiety that people feel around these natural. I like your term, the magic. I think that would be a lot cooler. You and I've talked about that a lot, though, the magic of it all.
Yeah. Yeah, but think about how unceremonious most women's transition into womanhood is. I mean, it's like, oh, okay. Are you in pain? Do you need an Advil? Here's a pad or tampon, whichever you're ready for. Do you know how to use this? Like, it's very unceremonious.
Medicalized.
Yeah. And so it's unfortunate, you know, that's the really a wonderful opportunity to introduce the divine feminine to a young woman.
How would you do that? How do you propose that we do that?
Right. Well, I mean, I'm just imagining, like, if I could go back in time and write my own script. So I'm projecting, obviously, but, you know, I can imagine drawing her a bath and putting rose petals in it and lighting candles and explaining to her what's going on, you know, physically, physiologically, what's happening to her. We would have probably given her some heads up that it was coming soon, but, you know, maybe in more detail. If it was a school day, I got to tell you, I wouldn't have her go to school. Like, mine happened on a school day, and it was like I was dropped off. And even though I probably was wearing a light day pad at the time, it felt like I was wearing a giant diaper. You know what I mean? Like, you don't know who you are on that day. You know, you're becoming somebody else. And so just need a minute, you know, I just need a minute.
Yeah.
I don't want to go to science class or history class the day I become a woman. Or PE.
God, sounds miserable. That whole thing sounds acting as if this thing isn't happening when it's happening, and it's supercharged. I mean, that, and also the crazy thing is, for men don't have those kinds of opportunities, you know, to connect with the biological marker of a transition. You know, they're kind of created out there or through ritual. And so if men also need to understand that, you know, as you're talking, I'm thinking, like, what are the conversations to have with boys too about, you know, what is that? Because we really need to be doing all of it so that when young girls are walking through, and, you know, they're supported in that process rather than, you know, ridiculed or they're embarrassed by it.
Yeah. You know, and then of course, you know, the moms themselves would have to know, but I referenced the 5th vital sign earlier, and to bring some context to that. So vital signs are what, you know, when you're being triaged or seen by your physician, they'll take your temperature, check your blood pressure, check your heart rate, etc. These are evidences of whether or not your body's under too much stress. And women are blessed with this 5th one, which is our cycles.
Uh-huh. Wow.
So if they could be, initiated into, okay, here's what you're going to be looking for. And when that's not what you see, it's an indication that you're under too much stress, and you get to figure out, you get to analyze and be curious, like, is that emotional stress? Is that physical stress? Is it both? Am I living in a house or in a community that's got too much exposure to chemicals that my body was not made to accommodate?
It brings up the other thing. I wrote down a lot of things, but when you were going through that list of how acupuncture and Chinese medicine can support the body, that was an impressive list.
Right.
I mean, I live with you, and I was like, holy moly, like that. To hear that all encapsulated, and we talk about this stuff all the time, but it's like that's radical to think about.
Yeah.
And it should, and for anybody watching this, I get to hear Leela Scott's stories about when that happens in her practice. And that, I mean, we are in these laboratories, where there's hardcore verifiable evidence that these kinds of approaches do a result is, a thickening of the lining, like, wow.
Right. Well, and when you say when that happens, the context to that is when I come home and say, somebody who hasn't ovulated in months ovulated on her own for the first time,
Right.
After this many sessions, or somebody who had repeated miscarriages is now carrying, or,
Right.
There's any number of things you've heard me say that just show how much.
And I guess I've seen that book around, The Fifth Vital Sign, and to hear what that means, and to hear it that is a fascinating, measurable aspect of the work. So often the way that I work is a lot of subjectivity. Like, how's your sense of well-being? Well, it's in a world of kind of immeasurable qualitative dynamics, as opposed to when you are working with the female body, there are these kind of literal, measurable, identifiable, seasonal, like cyclical aspects of the body. Wow.
Right. Well, and the other piece too that's important to mention is that I can't tell you how many people come in and they're, we're talking about her cycle and all these like details about it. And I'll say, what about pain? Do you have any pain? Well, yeah, but that's normal because everyone around them suffers pain. I myself used to suffer tremendous pain. It's not normal. It's not normal for your cycle to hurt. That means that something is out of balance and we can fix that,
Well, riff on that for a second. What might that mean if a cycle hurts?
Well, it gets a little bit off into the actual, physiology of Chinese medicine, but it would more than likely mean, although you really have to work with somebody intimately to be very specific about what it means, but generally what it probably means is that they have something called liver qi stagnation, which qi meaning vital energy. That's as close of a translation as we can come up with, so that the liver essentially which is responsible for this free flow of energy in your body. So there's not this like stuckness feeling. Well, when it's time to cycle, right? Like normally your uterus should be able to kind of contract and shed, and that's not a painful process. It's just doing this shedding process very smoothly and painlessly. But if our liver qi, our liver energy is backed up, or the liver is unable to do its job because of all these stressors that it's having to process, all these other stressors, you will experience the pain. So we would go about soothing the liver, restoring that free flow of energy, and its paired organ is gallbladder. I'm trying to feel like how deep to go into this, but
Big rabbit trail, yeah.
Right, gallbladder is very important in the muscle, tendon, ligament tone. And so by restoring the health of the liver, because of course it's a muscle, right? The uterus is lined in muscle. So it would also, for that reason, improve.
Well, and it brings up the other one of the other things I wrote down. It's sad. It's a sad aspect of our language, which is, a pregnancy is either positive or negative, and those are such loaded concepts with good and bad. It becomes a moral issue, and even as you're saying that, like, I wonder if there's somebody listening, or even that's not, but just this as a reality. When a cycle does hurt, how quickly somebody probably moves into something is wrong. This is not good. My, back to your, I loved your mom, the body is failing me.
Mhm.
And I just wonder how you
Well,
get through that.
this is important for you to know as a therapist who works with women, that pain of this cycle really cycles back into hatred of self,
Yeah.
hatred of being a woman. So they've got that all coming at them from the women's oppression stuff that we talked about, seeping in through the walls. And then it has to hurt for me to cycle. Are you kidding me? And I want to be pregnant and it's not happening for me. I hate myself. I am a woman and I'm broken. This is awful. It's just, it compounds the issue tremendously.
Thank you.
Hopefully there have been lots of takeaways today so that you can engage with your body, start to be curious about your body. And there's also a lot of, medical stuff about being a woman that acupuncture and Chinese medicine could possibly help you with. So hope you've enjoyed today's episode. I guess this was section 4 of our Renaissance series. And please reach out to us if you have further questions about your own fertility or just pain with your cycles and fertility, really, where it comes to either wanting to get pregnant or wanting to avoid pregnancy. This information remains true regardless of your preference. So thanks.